Hi, everyone. Welcome to Inquirer Live. I'm Alison McCook, Assistant Opinion Editor for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Today, I'm joined by Rebecca Traister. She's an award-winning author and writer at large for New York Magazine. You've probably seen her on MSNBC or Bill Maher or any number of other shows. She talks and writes about women in politics, media, and entertainment from a feminist perspective. I will listen to anything she has to say about anything. She's the author of 3 books. 2 are New York Times bestsellers. We've got Good and Mad and All the Single Ladies. That's my favorite. And Big Girls Don't Cry. Today, we're going to be talking about a key issue she knows a lot about, abortion and the state of Pennsylvania politics. Just before we bring Rebecca on the screen, I'd like to remind the audience you can participate anytime during the discussion. Just submit questions and comments using the comment section below. If you're watching on social media, you can head over to inquirer.com/live to do so. And now I'd like to welcome Rebecca to the screen.
Hello.
Let me first start by answering a question probably on a lot of people's minds if you're watching. It is, how did I, a relative unknown, bring in Rebecca Traister, who is very well known? And the answer is that she's from the Philadelphia area, in case you didn't know, and we know each other personally from high school. We went to, since 9th grade, we went to school together in Philadelphia. So that is the answer to that question. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for letting me call in this favor and bringing you on the show.
It's not a favor. It's like a great professional pleasure. And we, have worked in the same industry covering different topics, but,
yeah, yet now here we are.
And now here we are.
Here we are. Okay, so let's just start by talking about the thing that you know so much about, write about, talk a lot about, that's incredibly important. That's abortion. And maybe we can start by talking about the role that it played in the recent elections, which were, even if people moved on, those elections were very consequential. We're seeing the results now as people start taking office. So maybe you want to start talking about that.
Yeah, I mean, these midterm elections were, fascinating and crucial across the country on state and federal levels. They were the first elections that we had after the overturn of Roe v. Wade via the Dobbs decision this summer. And, the amount of, it's very hard to measure what any individual single issue, the kind of impact that it has on a given election result, because so much has to do with the candidates and how they're talking about those issues, how they're integrating them with other issues, the makeup of the districts and what issues are most pressing for certain populations. It's really hard to pull apart. But one of the things that seemed absolutely true across the board, and let's talk specifically about Pennsylvania in a second, but across the board in November, is that people really did seem to be voting in part for reasons having to do with continued access to abortion care in the wake of the Dobbs decision. In Pennsylvania, this is particularly crucial because, as you know, and I'm sure a lot of the people listening know, in the last session of the state legislature, there was a vote to pass a constitutional amendment that would theoretically ban abortion. With the fall of Roe, the question of what happens to abortion rights, protections, and access falls to the individual states, and it's an ever-changing set of dynamics in those states. And because the Republican-controlled legislature in Pennsylvania, there are all these, every state has different rules and very arcane processes and everything. And because there had been this vote in the Republican legislature in the last session, there's one of the technicalities, as best I understand it, and you can correct me, is that if you take that vote twice successfully in 2 successive sessions of the legislature, that's how you can pass it. And so it really is not an exaggeration to say that when it came to state government in Pennsylvania, abortion access was very much on the line. And then there were the Senate election, and John Fetterman. And Fetterman is a candidate who I happen to profile in my job for New York Magazine. I wrote about him at length this fall. And he was a candidate who was making abortion central to his campaign in his role going into the United States Senate, that of course has enormous power over the judiciary, the federal judiciary. And there was also talk, though I think that it is it's an incomplete conversation about whether or not a Senate majority on a federal level could vote to codify Roe. So the impact of the Dobbs decision on how these campaigns were run was very great. And then I think it's fair to say that the impact of voters' desire to see access to abortion remain legal in Pennsylvania probably was pretty determinative, or part of the number of factors that determine the outcome in Pennsylvania. And in fact, a Democratic House and a Democratic House on the state level, and the election of John Fetterman to that Senate seat.
Yeah, I mean, I you know way more about this than I do, but I've seen some exit polling from after the election, and it asked people, you know, what issues were driving your decision. And at least for Senate and governor in Pennsylvania, a really sizable number of people said abortion was the key reason that they were making the choice that they did, especially if they were voting as a Democrat, if they're voting for either Fetterman or Governor Josh Shapiro. And that really surprised me, just because I think going into the election, I thought everyone says it's the economy, like anyone only, you know, gas prices will dictate the outcome, but not according to these data that I saw. It was that surprising to you?
So everything's surprising to me, because I actually think it's not true that we know what's going to happen. People in my industry, political pundits, like to come into conversations like these with a kind of predictive authority that I don't believe is real. So yes, everything surprises me. I never know what the outcome of an election is going to be. I didn't know what the outcome was going to be anywhere. But I will say that the results, so in that way, am I surprised? Yes, I'm constantly interested in what happens. That's how I would put it. But I don't think that the results or those kinds of numbers on people being motivated to vote in part because of their investment in keeping abortion legal and accessible, it shouldn't shock people as much as it often does. And there are a couple reasons behind that. One is there's this history. We've grown up, and you know, we were born. I was born in '75. That's probably also you're right. We are the same age, the same year. So I was born into a post-Roe United States, in which in which the Democratic Party has always treated abortion as though it was this incredible hot button issue. There was a political myth for years, and in part it came out of the 1970s when people were in fact very, very divided on legality, and then persisted through years when it shouldn't have, that the United States was split down the middle on how it felt about abortion, right? That it was a lightning rod issue. We were completely divided on it. It turns out that a lot of that misapprehension came from bad polling. Pollsters would go out and say, do you believe in abortion? And people would say yes or no. And it really is only within the past probably 10 years that a new generation of pollsters actually started asking the questions differently. And this is across the United States, to Democrats and Republicans, to everybody. They started asking the questions in a different way. They'd ask the first question, which is, do you personally believe in abortion? Or would, you know, and then you'd get that sort of half and half answer, or closer to it. And then the second question would be, do you believe that it should be made inaccessible? Do you believe that it should be banned? And once you started asking it as a second question, so that respondents could voice their personal feelings about it, and then secondarily say whether or not they thought it should be regulated by the state or prohibited by the state, you began to get these numbers across the board, including in purple and red states. And we saw that in Kansas this summer, where between 60 and 75% of people, even in red states, wanted abortion to remain legal. And so, in fact, it is one of the most popular planks in a Democratic platform, even though even Democrats have never quite treated it with the, you know, muscular investment that they might have as they go out and campaign, because everybody's been taught to be sort of nervous about it. Like, people feel funny about abortion. Well, actually, no. And here was one of the big tests of that. The second thing that you mentioned in that is this distinction that's made between abortion as an issue that people would vote on versus the economy, right? And we saw that point being made a lot, again, by people in my profession, by Democratic politicians, especially in the fall weeks preceding the election. There was a lot of talk, especially after the Kansas referendum that passed so resoundingly protecting abortion access in Kansas. Suddenly Democrats wanted to run on abortion. Everybody was talking about abortion. Even Joe Biden, who hates the word abortion, was saying the word abortion, right? And then in the later fall, as we got closer and inflation, was going up and gas prices were rising, we started to hear from people, political pundits, saying, oh no, Democrats are talking too much about abortion. They should be focusing on the economy. Bernie Sanders wrote an op-ed sort of saying abortion is important, but we can't just talk about abortion. We have to talk about the economy. We have to talk about, childcare and one of the things that some people have pointed out, but that really came out, I think, in the voting, is that distinction between abortion as an issue that is distinct from the economy doesn't really make sense for a lot of people. And I think particularly a lot of young people. Abortion is certainly an economic issue. And I think especially for a lot of the young voters who you saw voting in really high numbers, unmarried women who were a huge Democratic voting bloc in 2022, questions of if, when, and under what circumstances to start a family or continue or end a pregnancy are absolutely a fundamental building block to how they conceive of their economic stability in their lives, right alongside housing costs, around policy questions around paid leave and childcare. All of these things are a piece. And especially when you talk about young voters who are thinking about what their adulthoods are going to look like, but, economic issues are family issues, are reproductive issues, are housing issues, are education issues, right? These are all melded together. And I think it's a remnant of an older set of attitudes about abortion, that it's somehow not completely entangled with economic questions in front of all kinds of people, right? And that it's somehow more associated, it's just gendered, or it's cultural or religious or about sex in some other corner of the universe. No, it's very much the ability to control bodies, sex lives, families. All that is very much tied into how many of us live our economic lives.
Yeah, that makes so much sense to me, actually. And it explains a lot. It may explain in part why Fetterman was so successful because he kept abortion like front and center in his message to people. So what do you know? Because I know you cover national politics, so feel free to say, this is not an issue you know too much about, but like in Harrisburg, it felt like we had this flurry of activity after Roe v. Wade was overturned to pass this constitutional amendment. And you're right, it had to pass in 2 successive sessions, and then it would go up for a vote. Like it would go to the public to vote on. And what do you know about the state of that in Pennsylvania right now?
Well, I probably am not, I shouldn't be answering this question authoritatively because I know only what I've learned. And again, this speaks to the complexity of the abortion issue on a state by state basis, because every state has these different weird arcane things, and weird occurrences can shape what happens in terms of making law and policy. So as you, and again, I'm sure a lot of people listening know, Democrats won the majority in the House, in the state House, but then didn't seat a majority because of one death and I believe 2 other Democrats who won higher office. And there's a special election scheduled for, I believe it's now scheduled for early February, right?
Yeah,
February 7th.
Yeah.
And but until then, the Republicans theoretically have the majority. Now, there was some talk, I saw speculation in the late fall about would they try to get through another vote on the abortion ban, and they didn't try it. And I don't even know that there's settled law. So much that's happened since Dobbs has revealed exactly how unsettled and unsure so many of these things are. I think a lot of people never anticipated that Roe was going to fall. And those who did imagined, I was told a million times as I reported on this over the years, like, well, Roe is likely never going to go anywhere. But if it does, it'll just go back to the patchwork of the states, as if that was some cogent reality where like in X state, this will be the law, and in X state, this will be the law. Pennsylvania is one of these states, but everyone is in its individual way, where things are going to be constantly changing and confusing. And so the situation right now in Harrisburg is that we're waiting to get a real Democratic majority. At which point then there's a question about who's going to lead the caucus, because Joanna McClinton was supposed to lead the caucus, was supposed to be, I believe, the first woman to be the Speaker of the House in Pennsylvania's history. And she did not wind up taking that job, a moderate Democrat, because of the confusion around who has the majority. The moderate Democrat who could get votes from Republicans wound up the Speaker of the House. Joanna McClinton voted for him. Is that going to change when there's a Democratic majority? What will happen at that point? All these things are kind of open and unresolved questions.
Yeah, and I think that gets to something that you and I have talked about before, which I'd love to dive in more, and that's the lack of female leadership in Pennsylvania politics. I think, I was on a personal level kind of excited to see a woman, Joanna McClinton, step in, and then now confused about when I think about it a lot, like, what's that going to be now? And I think part of it was that it was seeing a woman doing it. So maybe you can talk about this, like how you see things in Pennsylvania in general.
One of my favorite subjects is the states in which the history of women in electoral politics is embarrassingly terrible. And
Pennsylvania, one of your favorite topics.
It really is, because it's so strange. Listen, I was born and bred in Philadelphia with enormous pride and like a real sense of like, this is where many of the basic tenets, right? If you grow up in Philadelphia, it's like it's the birthplace of the country's promise, right? Yeah. And you also come to understand that so many of those country's original promises forged in Philadelphia have taken a really long time to even begin to get met, and we're not there yet, right? But I do think that we have certain stories we tell ourselves about the makeup of the country and about an East Coast where it's not that Pennsylvania has a reputation as a blue state, right? It remains a swing state, but it's one of these East Coast states, New York, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, with long histories and long democratic structures. And in fact, you'd think that those states would be the ones that were sort of pioneers with progressive and inclusive politics. And in fact, it's the exact opposite. States in the United States West were, first of all, often the first states where women could vote, definitely states where women rose to elected office and gained power. You look at the history of Texas and Ann Richards, Kay Bailey Hutchinson, Barbara Jordan in Texas. California has represented starting in 1993 by Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein, the first state, I believe, to have two female senators. And the East Coast states that I sort of was raised to think of as the progressive standard bearers actually had totally wretched records of women in politics. New York, where I lived for 25 years, hadn't elected a woman to the Senate until 2000 when Hillary Clinton was elected, and just elected the first female governor. Massachusetts had, barely anybody until Elizabeth Warren. Now there is a female governor in Massachusetts. Well, Pennsylvania still hasn't elected a female senator, a female governor. There have only been 12 women who served in the House of Representatives from Pennsylvania in the state's history. And 3 of those were like before 1960 and took over for their dead husbands, which was one of the early paths to elected office for women was called the widow's mandate, when you took over for your husband after he died. So what is 12 minus 3? 9. And I think, hold on, I have to look and make sure I'm getting this right. I feel quite certain that Marjorie Margolis-Mezvinsky, who was elected when we were seniors in high school in 1993, was the first sort of contemporary woman. I hope I'm getting that right and not screwing it up, but I think it's true. So it's a really wretched, and I was really struck when I was reading about Joanna McClinton. I wrote this down because I was so struck by how sad it was when she explained why she voted for a different speaker. One of the things she said was that she had been looking forward to being, to having this historic role, and described herself as having been the only woman to be a floor leader in this oldest legislative body in the nation, and the first woman in my caucus to be caucus chair. and that she would love to be the first female Speaker of the House. Obviously, also the first Black woman to be Speaker of the House, and she's not. But it was just, I was like, wow, that's really dismal. The first woman in my caucus to be caucus chair. You know, it's really pretty bad how little female representation. And it was something I also thought about when I was profiling John Fetterman this fall. It was really interesting because because of my interest, I happened to go to a bunch of events that were specifically Women for Fetterman. They were very focused on reproductive rights and access. And there were all these women in like their nasty women t-shirts but like the candidate who they were very excited about and was absolutely putting abortion front and center was also like a big straight white dude, like a very like macho energy, John Fetterman. And I thought a lot in that period about Lynn Yackel, who again, this was in 1992, Lynn Yackel came within like a percentage point of beating Arlen Specter for that Senate seat. In the wake of Arlen Specter's behavior during the Anita Hill hearings in the fall of 1991, there was a surge of women running for office, and 4 women actually did get elected to the Senate. It was called the Year of the Woman in 1992. It was Feinstein and Boxer, Carol Moseley Brown, and Patty Murray. And the person who came super close but didn't quite get it was Lynn Yackel. And that made a huge impression on me, you know, when at the end of our high school lives. And, you know, she came the closest, I think, that a woman has yet. But that's a big project for Pennsylvania, is electing more women.
What's the deal? Like, why is there this? I mean, we're half the population. Why can we not? We see other states doing it. Why can we not make it happen, in your opinion?
I don't know what the why is. I really don't. I mean, I know we can talk endlessly. It took the United States a really, really long time to begin to elect women at all in any state, right? I mean, we know, look, we're still talking about whose bodies are regulated, whose bodies are policed, right? And they're not the bodies of white men, who also happen to be the history of our leadership and political leadership in this country. So we know that that there are other kind of bodies that don't do the regulating and the policing, but are in fact regulated and policed. And those are really old messages that we have in our heads. It is true that other states have taken have shifted. I mean, you look at Michigan. Michigan just elected a female governor, a female secretary of state. You know, the lieutenant governor is a Black man. The attorney general is a white woman. There are, you know, lots of states, once they get over the barrier, which seems in many cases to be electing one woman, and then you begin to understand that political leadership could look different from the way that it has historically. Sometimes, you know, there's this kind of cheesy thing that used to get said in women's groups, like if you can't be it if you can't see it. And I always kind of rolled my eyes at it, but like there's actually something. It's about who we can conceive of. What does leadership look like? And we really are raised with ideas, whether we rationally understand them to be flawed or not, about what a leader looks like, sounds like, who they are. And it takes generations, centuries apparently, to effectively challenge those ideas and to begin to consider entire other populations that would permit our ideas of leadership to expand. And once you start electing women, it other states will show you, then you can elect a lot of them kind of really quickly.
Yeah.
But getting over that first big one, it takes time. And Pennsylvania is now like really, really, really behind.
Yeah, I mean, I even looked up this morning to see even Philadelphia, this sort of like, you know, place of progressive ideas and politics, has never had a woman mayor, which that astounds me a little bit. So yeah, I'm glad you're talking about this and thinking about this.
Well, mayors is really interesting. There are people who believe, there are some people who study this who think that the path to the presidency for a woman, which of course we're not there yet, right?
Yeah.
Is like executive power. So mayors are really crucial in that. So it also, there are differences in how, electing a woman to be governor is a different kind of thing than electing a woman to be a senator, right? Are you part of a deliberative body? Are you part of a governing body, or are you the boss? And mayors, there is a school of thought. There right now, God, I don't have the count anymore, but around the country, there's a group of Black female mayors who are really on a path to executive power. And because it's a model for that kind of executive leadership that can really alter people's ideas of what it means to have somebody at the top of government, right? And so I think mayor's races are really important. I don't think there has ever been a female mayor of Pittsburgh either, right?
I don't know, but that's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, if people know, they can put it in the chat for us if they like. Okay. Do you want to talk a little bit? I mean, I think some of our readers may have really read your profile on Fetterman. I certainly read it. It was really fascinating, leading up to the election. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, or about, your interactions with him? And Giselle, I was reading about, she's working to be a volunteer firefighter now, which I thought was just so fascinating.
Who's working to be a volunteer firefighter?
Giselle Fetterman.
Giselle is?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, there was just an article that came out today. It was like just talking about her life still in Braddock and what she's doing now that he's stayed in DC, and that's one of the many things that she's doing.
Wow. Okay, so the timing of my profile was I'm curious about how he's doing right now. And I know he just got his committee assignments. I saw him at a particularly tenuous moment. He had this summer, after he'd had his stroke, where he had been off the campaign trail completely, but very active on social media. And I wrote in my profile, and I don't need to rehash this, and he's won the election, so I don't know if it's interesting to people, but it was very interesting to me as a political reporter, because my assumption covering campaigns and politicians is that a lot of the public stuff is comms work, is communication staff that comes on and like makes the jokes or gets the one-liners or whatever. And of course I had assumed that was the case. He had this incredible Twitter campaign during the summer where he was just dunking on Dr. Oz mercilessly. Yeah. I mean, it was hilarious and kind of devastating. And but I frankly had assumed, especially since I knew that he had been recovering from a stroke, that this was like a bunch of kids who were very social media savvy and had good senses of humor. And so one of the major things that I learned when I started spending time with him in his campaign in September is that, like, for real, legit, it was him. Now, eventually other people chimed in, but that the lead for that was him, because even though he had communicative challenges post-stroke, in that he had auditory processing challenges that made it hard for him to hear conversation. He could understand it. He didn't have any cognitive challenges, but it made it hard for him to have conversations in real time, but he could read and was online all the time, and he had to walk as part of his rehabilitation. And so in the weeks after the stroke, when he was home in Braddock, he was walking and walking and walking and thinking, and he was able to be online and be on the internet, and he was coming up with these kind of like, whatever, sick burns, and proposing them directly himself to his campaign staff. And then when they'd go over big, then everybody would sort of chip in with other ideas for other jokes. But he was the one who said yes or no to all of them. So that was a really interesting, I think it is unusual and speaks to probably Fetterman personally, but also generationally, as somebody who really is a kind of online, a digital, fluent online is, I guess, how I would put it, which is something that we see now with politicians. That was something that AOC brought to Congress, right? Like, she knew how to be online. She knew how to communicate using different tools. And I think Fetterman really had that going for him, at least from Twitter. I mean, I don't know that he was a huge hit on, TikTok or whatever, but like, this is he had a fluency that a lot of politicians lacked, and that was really key to his communication. But then by the end of the summer, there was all kinds of pressure on him to debate, to come back in person. And then when he did come back in person, he still had some speaking challenges, auditory processing challenges that made his speech halting sometimes. And that was exactly the period that I was reporting on him. And it was a remarkable and very terrifying period, because I think people really, really were aware of how much was at stake in that election. And one of the dynamics that I was very interested in writing, as I do so much about gender and power, and was the degree to which this guy who'd gotten a lot of his public persona was, again, like a very masculine, white masculinity, like shorts guy, big, enormous man, and invulnerable, tough. And it had actually enabled him to hold a lot of progressive positions, which are often feminized within partisan context, by being like the tough working class guy from Western Pennsylvania, tough working class white guy from Western Pennsylvania. And yet here he was in a very physically vulnerable position. And his body was being pulled apart. The right-wing media was really going after various things about his physique. He was being mocked for conversational missteps, and he was acutely aware of that, spoke about it in his speeches. But it was fascinating to me, having spent so many years covering female candidates, where every word, every stutter, every misspeaking is just like harped upon as a signal of their weakness or incompetence or stupidity or whatever, where their body is analyzed. And here was Fetterman experiencing a lot of those same dynamics. And so that part was very interesting to me.
And is that part of what drove you to write about him? Because I think of you, I mean, you've written about Dianne Feinstein and all these women.
Yeah.
And then you came out with this profile with John Fetterman, and I was like almost surprised. And then, reading it made sense. But is that part of what drew you to him?
Yeah, it's very rare that I read a profile of a guy.
Yeah.
And I mean, I kept saying to my editors, I was like, I write about gender. He has gender, right? Like he's got gender too. But I think what drew me to it, in part, I think it was my home state's crucial race. I mean, not to say that the Shapiro race wasn't also crucial, but like it was. So it really drew me back. I really do have incredible memories of Lynn Yackel's almost win in '92, and that Senate seat has that seat. And the Senate is so important. And I was acutely aware of how important the race was. I will say that when I first started to approach his team, I knew he'd had a stroke, but I had no idea. I hadn't been, and this is in the summer, quite soon after his stroke. I don't think I really knew how serious when I first started making Inquiry, because I was very curious about the gender dynamics, putting the stroke aside, of what it meant in the context of a post-Dobbs universe where the Senate was so in play, to have the hopes of Pennsylvanians riding on this like big guy, right? Like I actually was interested from that gender perspective, which is not to say that that's bad, but like it really, to have the conversation shift to become so much about abortion, and have one of the people who was being the most upfront about abortion be a big white guy like that. That was fascinating to me. And even before I understood how much the stroke was going to have an impact on his communicative abilities and challenges moving into the fall. So I had approached it just looking at that, his gender, his race, and abortion as a crucial topic was the nexus, and in my home state. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah. I'm going to cut to, just because before we run out of time, I want to make sure we give a chance for to have audience questions.
Yeah.
There are a few here. Let me see. Okay. Someone is asking about, what do you think, if anything, there's been the impact from Nancy Pelosi on our notion of women as leaders? How has she shaped our view of that?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the things about Pelosi is that her reputation was for such competence, right? And I'm
Did you say
neither
confidence or competence?
competence.
Yeah.
And I'm neither raving about her nor damning her, right? I'm just saying, like, the thing, her reputation, whether you liked her or hated her, or liked her politics or didn't like her politics, or like, is that, like, she just got this job done, right? This job that is an impossible job, being Speaker of the House, like,
Yeah,
welcome, Kevin McCarthy. This is like, it is an incredibly difficult job to herd cats. And so one of the things about Pelosi having had that historic role and being such a visible national figure in terms of political leadership is she got the job done in a way that I think that I'm grateful for. Whether or not I have both been a critic of Pelosi and a fan at various points, right? But I just think that the figure that she cut in Washington has probably helped to expand our imaginative reach when it comes to, like, can women do these jobs, right? Because, and let me just say, there are dozens, zillions of men who've done crappy jobs, and we don't sit around and we don't think, like, oh, that guy did a terrible job, and therefore I guess men shouldn't lead, right? But I'm always interested in the women who are out there because they are lone exceptions, and so much of our perception relies on how they do individually. And so from that perspective, I remain grateful that Pelosi was as effective as she was at herding the cats in her caucus for so long. Yeah.
Here's another question. Someone asking about whether the impact of women candidates who were pro-life or women voters who are pro-life in the recent elections. The questioner doesn't specify whether the pro-life women are voters or politicians, but maybe the pro-life movement and female vote and all of that in the midterms.
Well, I mean, the pro-life vote didn't have it. I mean,
Let's just say anti-abortion. Should we say instead of pro-life, anti-abortion?
Yeah, I'm never.
Which one do you prefer? Either one?
Anti-abortion is certainly more accurate, but I'm never very good. Like, I don't like the term pro-choice, and I find myself using it all the time, right? I think it's vague and non-specific, and yet I constantly say
like rote. It just comes out.
And similarly about pro-life, like, it just is in my head, and I don't ever judge people for slipping up and using those words that have been made available to us to describe movement. So I haven't yet seen a lot of analysis of any impact that the anti-abortion vote had. It lost in a lot of elections. It lost in Pennsylvania. It lost in Michigan. It lost. These are. It was an instance in which the vote on behalf of abortion rights and access dominated, I think, in most, not all, contexts. The question more specifically about the role that women have in an anti-abortion movement has always been, I mean, women have been among the most vocal crusaders in the anti-abortion movement. I mean, you can look no further than the Supreme Court to see Amy Coney Barrett, a virulently anti-abortion justice whose confirmation to the court sealed Roe's fate. This is not an issue where it comes down to, like, men are on one side and women are on the other. And though I hasten to add that there are also, like, a lot of the anti-abortion movement and segments of it are led by men too, right? So there are a lot of questions. We have so many questions opening up and ahead of us that we don't yet have answers to, in terms of how these sides, if they will realign at all. One of the things we did see reporting on and anecdata on, and I know I encountered a couple of people in Pennsylvania, for example.
Anecdata, I like that term.
Formerly anti-abortion voters who, when actually faced with the overturn of Roe, started, sometimes Republican, right-wing, and even, again, specifically formerly anti-abortion voters who, in the realization of, okay, this is gone, change the way they vote to vote for candidates who are on the side of abortion rights. There was a person who I interviewed in my story, the mother of an obstetrician who I met at a Fetterman rally, who had been a lifelong Republican voter. And she said to me, a one-issue Republican voter, in that she'd been anti-abortion. And that after Roe's overturn, she sat down with her daughter, who was the obstetrician, and began to actually reckon with the degree to which this would potentially criminalize doctors performing medical procedures, and suddenly switched and became a John Fetterman supporter. And there she was. And as she told me, it was because of abortion. And there are a lot, the newspapers were full of individual stories of people like that, right? Of Republicans who had not previously voted for Democrats, but who did in this context because of abortion. There are all kinds of questions. I don't, what kind of impact did those voters have? Is the switchover long-term, or was it just in this immediate post-Dobbs context? We don't have the answers to that, but there's certainly dynamics that I pay a lot of attention to and will be for many years.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So it's like when it's a theoretical idea, they're in favor of it. Once it becomes real, they look at it in a different way, and then to switch sides entirely is really fascinating.
Well, in politics, remember that happens a lot. A lot of votes on things that are not, that aren't real, can be done as performative signaling to a base, right? Look at Republicans who voted over and over again to repeal Obamacare, but then when it actually came down to it, right? Because who wanted to have taking healthcare away from Americans on their voting record?
No, I didn't.
The reality is very different from what happens in a context of impossibility. And by the way, I would say that's something that Democrats need to be thinking about moving forward in the context of abortion, because, we have spent the past 50 years watching right-wing politicians, especially the past 10 years since the rise of the Tea Party, watching right-wing politicians vote over and over again and losing votes that they knew would be losing votes to defund Planned Parenthood, putting forth ballot propositions, personhood propositions, suggesting that a fetus is a person legally, and things that they knew were going to lose. But to signal to a base and to voters what their values were. And now we're in a context where a lot of those they actually, now that it's possible, right? Now that you don't have the protection of Roe, how is that behavior going to change? But also to those on the side of expanding access in a situation in which there's going to be a lot of loss, right? In which it might be about putting things forward, ideas forward that are going to lose and lose and lose. What are the benefits of doing that? What are you signaling to people about what you're willing to fight for? These are real long-term strategic questions to be asked of both sides.
I think that's fascinating. I think we need to end on that, because I thought that was like a really interesting question to ask, and really important for us to think about going forward. So thank you so much for joining us, everybody, for this interesting conversation with Rebecca Traister. For more information, you can go on our upcoming interviews, head over to inquirer.com/live for the full listing. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. This was like such a thrill. It's the first time I've done it. I'm so glad I could do it with you. I hope I'll see you at the reunion. Maybe.
Maybe.
We can talk about that offline.
It was totally wonderful to be here with you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm your host, Alison McCook, assistant opinion editor at the Inquirer, and thank you so much.